Hey, Peter.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing good, man. How you doing?
Good. Well, welcome everyone to our Twitch live stream here of Chaos and Startups. I'm Peter Nesbitt, and I'm here today with Kayvon Ferruzzi. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself, Kayvon, and I'll jump to myself after that?
Yeah, sure. My name is Kayvon. I've been in sort of like the startup world for the better part of the past 10 years. Started a couple of companies, a couple of them failed. One of them got acquired, ended up working at a company that served startups. I worked with a couple of hundred companies when I was there, helping them think through fundraising and strategy. Then ended up doing a carve out of the company that I'm running now. I've been running that for about 2 years. Again, our main clients are startups ranging anywhere from 2 people up to pre-IPO. And as a company, we work with about 2,000 companies over the past 7 years.
Yeah.
Learn a couple of things. So
Oh,
got my teeth kicked that in a couple of times myself. And so anyways, here's the share.
cool. Yeah, I'll introduce myself in a second, but I'm sure you could hear the background noise there. I just want to remind everyone here what Stimulus TV is about and what we're doing here. So, Stimulus TV is a coalition of talented individuals and small businesses most affected by the pandemic, rallying around the community to give a platform to support providing value and help fundraise for the Stimulus TV COVID Relief Fund. So there should be a link at the bottom of the screen there that if you so feel called, feel free to donate if you find our podcast interesting or valuable. Yeah, and so I'm Peter Nesbitt, as I mentioned. I currently work at a startup now here in New York, a fintech SaaS company. But I've been in and out of the startup space for me the last 10 years, working everything from like seed stage, trying to start a couple of my own startups, working at a venture capital fund, and also at startups at stage Series A, Series B, and Series C. And we can talk a little bit about those different stages in funding probably in later episodes. But I just want to give you a little context of like my experience as well. So Kayvon, I thought it'd be great to kick this off with asking you just why did you think about why do we want to start this series in the first place?
I mean, it was interesting because when you and I were sort of chit chatting about it, I think one thing that came to light is how in the last call it recession, so many great companies came about from that time, and then when you had the dot-com bust in 2001, you have some fantastic companies coming out of that stage as well. So as people thinking about, do I give this thing a try? I think historically, if you look at Airbnb or Uber or GitHub, when these companies coming up in OA, one thing that's unique about them is when they happen to take risk, if nobody else is taking on risk, they get this escape velocity. And so it's an interesting time as people thinking about, hey, do I want to start a company? So I think that was at least something that resonated for me. But as we've looked at some of the startups that we sort of work with and we track, one thing that's interesting is between starting that company and going through any sort of exit or any sort of meaningful exit, it takes about 10 years.
Wow.
So it's not I'm going to get this started, get a couple of ideas, get started. It's a 10-year process. And I think so that's why I thought it would be a good idea to talk about what people can expect doing that.
Yeah, I was thinking of that too. Is like, especially now when you may have a lot of free time, either being unemployed, underemployed, or just stuck at home with your
Yeah.
parents' house. Like, what better time to work on that idea you've always wanted to work on?
Yeah.
And as we will talk about a little bit today, like your first couple of years are going to be most likely not going to have a product, not going to have revenue anyway, and so this is actually a good time to be working on those sort of side ideas, so that when the markets come back, whether it's in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, that you'll have something a little more developed. And that's like the perfect time for investors will be looking for ideas that they're available. And so we can talk more about, that process of both developing the idea and how to get investors and stuff like that later. But I think now is just such a great time. I think a lot of startups right now are in a real tough spot if they've already been around for a while, right? If they're pre-revenue or, even or pre-profitability, their backers have to decide if they want to continue to throw good money after bad. And it's really hard for investors to really think about investing in existing startups right now because they can always think that there might be a cheaper price later. And so I think this is again a perfect time to be thinking about starting your own product, your idea. I think today, hopefully, will be some good structure, not just today, but the next 3 weeks, some good structure of how we think about what we want to talk about, or how to help you get prepared to thinking about starting your own company.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little about kind of like
I
this?
want
Oh,
to ask for
go ahead, Kevin.
that. I want to ask for that just real quick.
Yeah.
I think anything that we talk about here, so I want to touch on two things, right? One is maybe 25 to 30% of this stuff can be taught, right? And the rest of it is people are just going to go figure it out. Usually companies have outsized returns is because they've done something that nobody else thought it would be done. So I think like number one is a lot of this stuff is applicable to some portion, but none of this is going to be, okay, like go through this, it's going to be done. Number two is, at least I'm speaking for myself, I will present probably nothing original. Everything I will say is going to be a synthesis of a bunch of different stuff that I've learned or I've gone through. So again, a lot of it, if you find like anything has been a copy, it probably is. That's number two. And then number three, I would say that a lot of this is just my personal experience. So I'll say whatever it is. If there's anything that resonated with people, hit us up. If there's anything that definitely didn't, even better. Like if we can learn perspective.
Yeah. Drop your questions or comments right in the chat, and we'll try to answer those. I see. Yeah, and we'll try to answer them throughout, but also definitely save some time at the end.
Anyways, that's my 2 cents.
Cool. So I wanted to, just before we jump into today's content or questions, I kind of want to give an outline of, like, at least so we have kind of outlined the next 3 weeks. So like this week we'll be doing this every week at 7 p.m. On Sundays. And this week we're going to talk about just like the general startup path, like what to expect in the first 5 years, generally how to test an idea and draft a hypothesis, and what does it mean to have alignment, and that's with generally with your company. And then a bunch of, I'm sure Kayvon and I have a bunch of war stories we can share as well. Anything else you want to share in that with what we're going to talk about today?
No, I think that's great. And I think in general, if you think about this sort of like as a journey, again, like taking a step back and saying, we're going to be in this for 10 years, right? If it goes well, odds are your company is going to fail. Actually, most people's companies are going to fail. So those are the odds. But if you do it right, you're going to do it for 10 years. So just mentally, it's similar to the quarantine, right? Like if mentally you say, I'm going to be here 4 weeks, it's going to be tough. If mentally say, I'm going to be here for 2 years, the strategy sort of changes. For startups, it's a similar idea. And so if you're going into it, then what it will help is to say, okay, what should I be working on over the next 6 months, then the following 18 months, then the following 2 years. So like essentially breaking this down into chapters, I think is helpful. And then within each of those chapters, then it's the idea of what do I or we as the founding team should be working on? Then what is the thing that we're working on? How are we talking about ourselves? Who are we talking about? What is the one thing that we're actually focused on? And so long as those things are aligned. So if you think about it, you have time going left to right, and then you have the characteristics of your team, the focus of them, the amount of money you have in the bank, the amount of money you should be spending. Those are kind of running down. What you want is you want an alignment. And that's sort of like what I guess like, sort of like what you were also talking about, essentially like where is your focus? So what we'll do over the course of the next 3 weeks, hopefully we'll cover that sort of end to end. For example, when you're just starting a company, you shouldn't be running around doing partnership conversations. Right? And a lot of people might do that and be like, oh, we have this great idea, we're partnering with so-and-so. It's like, that's great, but like, hold your horses. Like that's like, partnership is a distribution channel conversation, right? You shouldn't be focusing on distribution channels, that's great, but like there's other stuff that you gotta work on first. And your energy and your time as a founding team, that's the most important thing you have. So knowing where to focus that is important. So we will focus today a lot more about what should a founding team focus on, call it for the first 2 years. At least that's
cool.
That's my thoughts.
All right. Let's jump off.
Okay, cool.
All right.
So I'm gonna put some names on these. Some of them are comments, some of them are not, but just go with it and let's just use it for this conversation, right? So at the beginning part of it, and this is a mistake that some people do, and I've done it at least a couple of times, is I would get excited about an idea in the terms of a solution or a product.
Mhm.
So I might come out and be like, oh, I have this great idea for an app, or I have this great solution, I have this great business idea. And that is issue number one. That's problem number one, where you have already come up with the solution, and then you would go around finding the right person. They'll say, oh yeah, that's a great idea, and that makes you super happy. You shouldn't do that. You should, whenever I say you should is my suggestion.
Yeah.
Trust me. So my suggestion is that the best thing to do is approach this sort of like a science problem and saying, you have a hypothesis that this problem exists, and this is why that problem exists. Which means that in the first, call it 6 months, all that you ought to do is go around and figure out what is actually this problem. What is this problem? Where did it come from? Why does it exist this way? Who has it? Why do they have it? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What is the magnitude?
Gotcha.
Just only talk about problems.
So I think this is a good point, and there's a couple questions in the chat about like what should we be doing right now, right? Like everything's up. How do we plan for like more than a week ahead? I think the point is that most startups and investors who invest in them are betting on general macro trends and are taking a bet 10 years in the future. So like what's happening today or even happening next year doesn't really matter. What they're really betting on and what you should be thinking about is like, where's the puck going, 10 years from now? And so this sort of like problem identification piece is a great thing to do when you're stuck at home. You can do, surveys, call people. What are some other ways you've done sort of this kind of problem research before, Kayvon?
I would say I think reading history is very helpful and interesting because that will sort of help you think through what are the sort of like consequences that needs to happen so you can play that out. And I wanted to touch on this because this is one that I'm very fascinated by. So I think Jack Dorsey is one of the most capable executives, at least of our generation. And what's fascinating is that sometime in 2001, he's in New York, he's toying around with this idea of taxi cab dispatching. And so he's sort of like toys around with it, his computer science background, I think is a dropout. Anyways, he goes to California, he's toying with that in 2002, 2003, and he can't quite get it up. And at some point he's like, all right, forget about it, starts Twitter, gets busy doing that, then gets busy doing Square, all as well. And then what happens is in 2008, you have smartphones that are so cheap that people who are willing to be drivers can afford one, and there's a recession. And so when you get those two things happening, and mobile is just everywhere, you get those three things happen at the same time, and then you get Travis Kalanick. And what's interesting is that both Jack Dorsey and Travis Kalanick, born same year, both of them studied computer science. I believe both of them are dropouts. So it's like, it almost doesn't matter how good your founding team is. You also have to hit the waves right. So this is exactly what you're talking about. So you're actually not planning for what is happening next week because that is irrelevant. But if you can, again, study history and study sort of like what is happening in the landscape of society, not just right now, but what was happening 2 years ago and 4 years ago and 6 years ago, those are great. And then the final thing that I touch on that is, as a founding team, your greatest asset is that nobody knows you. And if you think about that, Google can't just run around doing absolutely stupid things because it's stupid. The stock will go and management has lost it, which means that a team at Google might not go out and say, hey, this process of renting your extra room could be a luxury, well-executed idea, right? They're not going to do that. But an Airbnb team might go and try a couple of different things. Well, then they land into this Airbnb. So what I would say is, if you're asking what should I work on, what I would say is do stupid things. Do things that when somebody looks at it, be like, that sounds pretty stupid, because that means everybody's taking it for granted. So that's generally a good place to start. And just see where it goes. Your biggest asset is probably being able to verify some of those ideas.
Gotcha. So I think that might be a good a good segue into kind of like the first like sort of like stage of startup life is the problem solution fit. Do you want to
Yeah.
talk a little bit about this stage? And I think maybe Will's caveat here is this stage is usually pre-external funding. I'll talk a little about that in a second. Like most people who start their own startups start initially just on their own on the side, without any funding of their own personal resources, at least until they've gotten a certain scale where they may get some sort of additional friends and family, to give them a small amount of capital. But there's a certain stage and like benchmarks you have to hit, and depending on what industry you are in, to get actually external investment from, say, a venture capital firm.
Peter,
So this is probably.
Go ahead. How often do you get people coming to you saying like, "Hey, like, how can we raise venture capital?" Like, how often is that the first question that comes to you?
In terms of like startup stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean,
people come up and be like, "Hey, look, we're going to."
Yeah, I know. I've had people ask me that before. It's too like, oh, I've got this idea. How do I raise money? It's like, great. Like that, the idea is like part of it. And don't get me wrong, I've done the same mistake as well. And the reason I say that is like, I've done this too, is like where you get so caught up in like making a pitch deck and like trying to, wow, wow, make certain early stage investors, which may be okay if you're trying to get accepted to say an accelerator program, but like in general, like that stuff comes later. Having the idea and even having some sort of product and having some sort of traction should come first. So I think that's what we should focus on here first. So do you want to jump into the idea around product solution fit?
Yeah, let me just take a step back and talk about problem solution fit. So the way that we talk about this is there's essentially at each step you're trying to match up things, right? So we say you are at the problem solution fit. So what that means is you have this idea that this problem exists, and that you have a pretty clear idea of why that is, right? Because two people or a group of people can all be frustrated about the same thing, but that actually might not be the problem, right? So let's say right now you want to go to a grocery store and we say, hey, there's a line for people to go in, right? Some people might look at that and they say, I'm frustrated because I have to stand here. And then somebody might say, I'm frustrated because I have something else to do. Those two could be the same, but they also could be separate things. And so unless you actually go in and sort of interview and understand fundamentally what is this sort of like common theme, then you might be proposing the wrong solution. So this is why when we talk about problem solution fit, when you go in and you say, hey, let me understand this problem, what you're really trying to do is you say, okay, person A, either through conversation or through surveys or through landing pages, there's a whole bunch of different ways, depending on the type of business that you're trying to do, that you can go and vet out this thing. But essentially you want to say, is this problem real? It's not just in your head. And then you want to say, hey, if the solution looked like this, would you use it? Would you sign up for it? Would you pay for it? Whatever it is. And you want to be very, you're trying to actually nullify this. You're trying to find out as many ideas not to pursue. So I think that's also a different way of going about it. Because there's a million things that you can do. You actually just want to do one of them. And a lot of times people might not know what it is. So you're trying to block and tackle that. So if you go and talk to people, don't be overly excited, and I've seen this in a lot of founders. They get so excited about the solution already, and they're just like, would it be so great if you do X, Y, Z? And the person they're asking is like, yeah, that sounds great. Like, just go do that. Leave me alone. Like, you want to be as objective about it as possible and explore that problem with them. So you say, okay, I know enough about the problem.
Yeah.
And so
I've got a great story with that. Like I was working, and this is in 2014 or 15. I left Carlisle, and this is before I was working at Bitly, and my friend wanted me to work on a startup idea that she had. Same thing, kind of had this solution idea. Right. And I went back. It's like, no, I'm going to do the core research on it. So the idea was, all these salons and, hairdressers have this downtime in the afternoon, when it's off-peak hours. So can you do some sort of demand pricing or demand discounting for that? So I walked around Manhattan for basically 2 weeks, talked to 60 hairdressers and salons and nail salons in the city and asked them, like, is this a real problem? And like, what would you want to see the solution like? And then I'd pitch them that solution. And like in this research, I found that most of them actually it wasn't a big problem for them. Like this is New York City, they're busy all the time, or they actually like the breaks. And so that's a sort of core thing. Like, I had this hypothesis about a problem, and like disprove the hypothesis around the problem and also around the proposed solution. Like when I pitched them they was like, hey, would this help you? Most of them were like, no, we wouldn't want that. And so I think that was, that's the kind of the sort of behavior or the activity around early stage work that's, I think, super valuable.
100%. Yeah, it's a lot cheaper to figure out what not to do than going and building out a bunch of stuff and investing your own money and savings. So and generally, and by and large, that's what sort of progresses your life cycle, right? So you probably want to spend something like 3. And then one other thing I want to say is some people might go and do research, and they're like, hey, we've done research. Here's a document from McKinsey. Here's like statistic, thus, this. Don't do it that way. Do the one-on-one, like really taking the time. You want to actually know who these people are, because in 6 months you're going to sell to them. So
and this is the sort of stuff that will eventually go in that pitch deck you do make. And so I think we had a question here of like, how important is the pitch deck being perfect? I think that the point is that, like, especially at an early stage, it doesn't have to be pretty. But this is the sort of core research. It's like, hey, I went and talked to 100 people. They said this is a problem and this is a potential solution. Like, that's a great, start of a pitch deck. And this is the sort of core stuff that will go in there. Quick questions here. I'm just going to quickly answer. Like, for people who are just tuning in now, Kayvon and I are not in business together. We are just friends, but just want to talk about startups, and especially about his experience and my separate experiences here in different startups.
I found that you and I talk about startups like a lot of people talk about sports. It's like, yeah, you started, you just raised like $2 million. Yeah, then so I don't know. This is stuff that we find interesting. And we run, and I run my own company, and Peter's been into the startup world.
Yeah. I was going to say, like, think about it this way. I'd rather have you talk to 10 more potential customers than like clean up a slide, like a slide in a slide deck.
Yeah. So
I think you're going to have way more value to that.
100%. There is I'll use this as an analogy. And a couple of years ago, Charlie O'Donnell, who's runs a venture capital firm here in New York, he was giving a talk. I can't remember what company he was referencing, but essentially it was this person who was trying to build out some sort of payment infrastructure. And the way that he went to his pitches, and he was literally like, I have these like 50 order forms from customers that are knocking down on my door and they're trying to pay me money. I just need to go build it. And like, you don't need a pitch deck for that. And this is where a lot of times, like VCs, you will talk to VCs when you get to product market fit. And nowadays, 10 years ago, you could have gone to a VC and say, hey, we're a good team, we can build this, and people will write you a check. The bar is now much higher. The reason this game keeps staying hard is because everybody's getting better all the time. So in 2012, if you came out and like, look, I know how to code iOS and I just know mobile penetration, it's like, oh, great, like here's a bunch of money. But now everybody knows how to do that. So nobody's gonna cut your check anymore. So now it's, 2 years later was you gotta have 100,000 users. Then it's you have 1 million users. Now it's like 10 million. So it's just, the game keeps getting harder. So the idea has to be around.
But the game is getting harder to get external funding, partially because the cost to get to those benchmarks is lower, right?
That's right.
There's all this like no code websites, Amazon Web Services, all these APIs, et cetera. So you can build a pretty functioning app for like free or like low thousands of dollars today versus it would have cost you hundreds of thousands, if not millions, even 5 years ago.
Right. And essentially VCs want to see that like you have escaped the herd, because if it all the cost is like 10 grand or like a couple of years of expertise to get something done, it's like, okay, well, you're there with like everybody else. What you want is to say, hey, everybody else is here, we're already here, and let's accelerate that. And so that's where you can go. And essentially what's nice is VCs are not, they should not be, just to give you an idea, look at the data. The first round of funding usually comes about a median about 2 years after a company is founded. And you can call the first round is about $1 million. If you're in the coast, it's a little bit higher. If you're in the middle of the country, it's a little bit lower based on cost of living and all that good stuff. But by and large, that's sort of like first institutional money. That takes 2 years. And if you want to think about it, it's like that's 3 to 5 people working semi full time, really committed. So if you want to do the math on that, that's 4 people working about called 2,000 hours for 2 years. That's 16,000 hours. So you want to go in front of VC after you put in about 16,000 hours, give or take, right? Look, you can be like a PhD scientist, or you could have just left Slack and you just have like a particular knowledge. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about like everybody else, and I'm pretty average person, so I can speak for the average. It just takes time. You got to go and like put in the work. If you're unique, that's awesome. We don't have a conversation. I don't have a conversation.
Great. So all right. So great. So you spent a certain amount of time doing initial core problem research. You've probably developed some sort of solution, at least in your head, or some potential solution. Like, what's the next step? Like, what's the next sort of thing you need to do?
So at that point, what we call the team solution fit. So what's the team solution fit? And you might hear a lot of VCs say, oh, it's all about the team, da, da, da. What essentially they're saying is, you have a group of people who can pull this thing off, whatever it may be, at least the first iteration of it. So you can go back to that same sort of cluster and say, hey, that problem that you had, the solution that we talked about, here it is. And so then you can move on to what's called the product market fit, or at least to a limited amount. But what's important about the team is the team needs to be able to put out whatever solution it is and then test it around that problem at effectively a zero cost. So what that means is you can't have a contractor. If you have contractors, that's going to cost you. That's keep sinking you. So then it's also black and white, right? Like people have obligations. It's not so easy for everybody to like work 40 hours a week for free, da 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 da. So there's this question of like, what does it mean to be a founder? And we've sort of like kicked the tires on this a bit. And there's a quantitative way of thinking about it and a qualitative way of thinking about it. And I'll present both. The quantitative way is you're working plus 30 hours a week on the idea. That's one. 2, you're taking a 90% haircut to your base salary. So it's essentially you're like really putting in equity. So that's just more of a quantitative side. On the qualitative side, it's helpful to do the chicken or pig test. The chicken or pig test is like, let's say you go to chicken and pig and you say, I want you to make me a bacon and egg breakfast, right? And so, the chicken is going to contribute to this breakfast, but the pig is committed, right? And that's right. It's not a very pro animal analogy, but I think that's sort of like really picture. It's like my heart and soul is into this.
Gotcha. So to summarize here is like you got to figure out who has the right talents or skills to actually start work on the solution, develop the product, and they have to be committed to it. And that comes in the form of just real work, and that's working on this mostly full time. Do you have any examples in your startup life? Oh, what was that?
Yeah, I just want to touch on something about that. The hour thing is kind of touch and go, and I'll say why. There could be a founder who's just not working 30 hours or 40 hours, but that particular person has very unique experiences in a very niche market. Maybe you see this a lot with like professional athletes, right? They might join a company, or celebrities. They're putting their brand in moving this product. They don't have to work all those hours, but they bring a certain asset that nobody else can. That is also at that same level. So it's, again, not always black and white like that. But again, it's this question of like, hey, this person is doing significant contribution to give birth to this thing. And I think the skill thing that you talked about, I want to touch on this, because I see sometimes people who are similar or have similar backgrounds will get on a project. You have 2 programmers who are both backend, or you get 2 business type people. That works sometimes. I think Warby Parker is a good example of this. Essentially 3 MBAs from Wharton sort of like started that. Generally, it's good to work with people who have different backgrounds, different skill sets, and not duplicate work. So it's probably don't want to have 2 finance people, unless you're doing like a hardcore fintech company. But yes.
So you're saying we should never be founders, Kayvon?
You and I, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Too much overlap.
Exactly.
Yeah. But
exactly.
Yeah,
so I think that's a good point. I mean, I think the classic founding team is like someone who can actually build the product, whatever the capacity is, probably full stack, and then someone who's on the hustler selling's marketing side. And that's kind of the classic founding team.
Yeah, I think
you cover all the functions with two people.
For software, it's like hacker, hustler, designer, and that's like generally like the right trio. There are companies. I think most successful ones are 2 or 3. And we looked at like 50 plus $1 billion companies some time ago. There's only like very small handful that were 1, mostly 2 to 3, very few that are 4 or more.
Yeah. I mean, I think the real reason is because like you only have so many hours in a day. You just need to split that work with someone else, and someone else to like, support you when you don't want to keep on going. So I think having at least 2 is super helpful versus trying to be a solo founder.
Solo founder is no fun. You lose it.
Yeah.
But I think like when you think about sort of like the people that you've sort of like started that previous company, how did you all meet? What was the dynamic there like?
Yeah, good question. So another company I worked on was called FAM. It was like more of like an events business, so it's not really going to be like VC backed in the first place. But like the people I initially started with that were people I knew in the community. One was like my girlfriend at the time, and the other was a good friend. Lots of issues when starting trying to start a company with friends in general, because like you might all be super excited about the idea, but there's a lot of, let's say, different sort of competing, maybe not a great overlap in terms of skill set, in terms of what action needs to be done. And it's just also much more challenging to manage. I think thinking about who you start a business with looking at your friends might be a good place to start, because like you're going to have you'll know them well. But at the same time, you should be looking maybe for some specific chemistry and skill set versus like just trying to like start something with your best friend.
Yeah, 100%. When I was 18 or 19, I did a clothing company in undergrad, and I was the sort of like a business person, figure out supply chain, figure out like vision, whatever. And I can't draw even a straight line. So I found this guy who was in one of my courses, great designer. We got together and we this company, and we had designs, and there was this mantra behind it, And then what ended up happening is after we put out the first batch, that relationship in that company is just like went sideways so hard. Mm-hmm. And the main reason for that was, I know now, is that he was much more interested in like just getting some products out so he can talk about it and show it to friends. I was trying to like actually build a large business. When you're 19 years old, when I was 19 years old, I didn't know that I should be thinking through, mission and vision and like long-term planning, right? So I think it's very helpful to go slow. I think that's the thing. It's actually much better to really get to know somebody, get to figure out what ticks them on, what ticks them off, why is it that they want to work on this problem, and just be like, do you want to do this for the next decade, right? If you're in your 20s, 20s are gone by the time you're done with this. If you're in 30, like, imagine like 30s, 40s gone. Like if you're going to spend it with this one person, if it's done right. If it's wrong, like 80% probability you're only going to spend a year, maybe 6 months with them.
Most startups will fail in that first year.
Like, the big thing is like, if this goes right, you got to make sure that like you're doing it with the right person, because this is your life.
So let's say, okay, so you got the team. What's next?
Yeah. So now you got a bunch of pigs. So that's great. Y'all are putting a lot of time in this, and what you're doing is you're trying to figure out the absolute least amount of work possible so that you can go back to that original group and say, hey, that problem that you had, does this solve this? And the response that you want is like, can we curse on this? I don't know if we can curse on it. Yeah. So it's like, the response that you want is just like, fuck yeah, like that's it. One thing to think about is like statistical sampling, right? So if your actual sample is like, we're going to show this to 100,000 people, and you only have the possibility to show it to 10, if you're off by like 3, or if it's lukewarm, if you think about it like degrees, you're going to miss that shot by like so much. That's why it's so important to like, when you have something, I think there's this adage of like, it's better for like 10 people to absolutely love your product than for 100 people to kind of like your product. And so that's sort of like what you're shooting for. And like, your product could be anything from like software security to something tangible to real estate, it doesn't matter. But now your team has gone, iterated, they came up with something, they showed it. And you're going for the fastest feedback loop. So that's the thing. So you have an initial problem, you got a team, the team can actually get together, they can pull this thing off. I think a lot about this. It's like in my head, it's like the Italian job. So like everybody gets together, they have different tasks. You got like it's a journey, right? And so as you have this journey, you got to make sure like your team is there and they deliver it. Once you deliver it, then you say, okay, this looks good. That's where you can actually get the data. So you say, okay, we have this data, and now you want to be able to say, okay, can I now go and tell the story to figure out what does it take to take this thing one magnitude higher? And this is another thing I want to touch on. It's good to think about whatever you're delivering in terms of magnitudes, and know that that's about as far as you want to go. I'll explain that. Whatever you're presenting between going from nothing to like having one person use it, that's great.
Yeah.
Then you can go, okay, how do I go from 1% to 10%? But never think like, how do I go from 10 to 100? Like you're gonna run into challenges that you just don't know. Don't plan for that. So just plan 10 to 100, then 100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000. That actually scales up quite fast. But that's essentially what you're trying to do here. At each of these levels, you're gonna need capital, or you might need capital. While you're vetting out the idea, that ought to come from yourself. It needs to come from your savings. It needs to come from borrowing. It needs to come from people who trust you. Because no investor will give you money if you haven't exhausted your own savings or your own brand. Your friends and family is your brand, right? So you gotta go completely that. If you don't have it, figure out a way to do it. A lot of work of a founding team is just squeezing out $1 out of a dime. So
yeah, if your friends and family haven't given you $10,000 for your product, then why should an investor?
Yeah, and frankly, it's like, look, not everybody comes from like a wealthy family. That's perfectly fine. But it's like your job as a founding team is to recruit great engineers, recruit big clients, like all this stuff. That's all it is. Like you're begging somebody. So like, yes, you're like nobody is gonna like give you something right away. But like as part of, I've been in the industry that I am now 7 years. I cold email all the time. And like I have a team, we have a sales team, I have a whole team. Like everybody does that. So if you're not comfortable with the idea of like going out to people and hustling, this is going to be challenging. There's other ways of doing it, right? Like, did Mark Zuckerberg go and beg people do it? No, but also he had a product where their biggest challenge was server space, right? So if you have something that is so the demand outweighs the supply so much, investors are going to write you a check, and that's awesome. That's, I think, the goal.
So I think that's a good definition of product market fit, right? So you're having demand out supply strip, which you can actually provide with your existing infrastructure or company. That's when you're going to have external institutional investors banging at your door.
100%. That's what you want. At that point, pitch decks, going back to that question, are usually two types. There are pitch decks that are selling the vision, especially at the early stages. This is the market, this is the team, this is what's happening. And then there's pitch decks that are data pitch decks. They are essentially just showing, here's time, here's what we set out to do, here's everything that we did. So they're showing revenue growth, they're showing user growth, they're showing conversion numbers, they're showing competition, they're showing like tangible things. They're like, we set out to do this thing, here's how we did it and beat it. What you want is a deck that's the latter. You want something that can actually show that you've delivered on the thing that you're saying delivering, you just need money to do more of it. That's product market fit.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So I just want to be cognizant of time, Kayvon. We got 5 minutes left. I thought it might be good to share, we can jump into maybe the next few years on the next call, or the next week. But I thought maybe good to share, maybe answer a couple of questions from the channel here real quick. Do you have the channel open? I can read them out real quick.
I don't have the channel, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's all good. So I think one of the questions here is like, one question is about, look, what advice is good to take right now? Maybe some cynicism about our, different, political leaders or economic leaders. I think, my view in terms of where to take advice is look for startups who've been successful, right? I think there's a lot of good material out there on this stuff. Y Combo has great coursework. Where else have you found good materials out there, Kayvon?
Honestly, How to Start a Startup by Sam Altman, who was the previous president of YC. They did these series of classes. It's about 20 hours of them. They're incredible. I go back to myself. Find good advice. Yeah, I mean, Mark Susser has a great blog. He's both a founder operator, and then he became a VC. I think in general, yes, those two, you're great shape.
Yeah. One of the questions, like where to raise your first 10K, and I think you answered this a little bit. And this is like blow up in your entire network, and this is if your network doesn't have 10K, just keep on looking. I think this goes back to the hustling and the cold contact, and selling people on your vision is not just selling customers. That's selling future employees as part of your team, and in selling investors. And that's really the real role of the founder.
Yeah, I just want to touch on that, right? If you want to think about the amount that you can raise, you can break it into the first 10K, the first 100K, and then the first 500K to $1 million. The first 10K should be used to verify that a problem is real. One way that a lot of people do it at this point, this strategy is sort of a little bit outdone, but it's using landing pages. So essentially just like, here's a landing page, here's a problem, here's a solution, give us your email, we'll contact you. Or go and buy some Facebook ads and just spend $2,000 on that, where it's just like a Facebook page, just a landing page, figure out like how to design, or go and get somebody who can design it for you and see how many people click it. Because if you put something out where the value of that thing is $100, right? And then you spend $20 and you get 50 possible leads, that is a great, like you figured out a problem that needs solution. Whether or not you can deliver it at that price is a different conversation, but there's different, like if you say, how do I raise my 10K, make sure you use that 10K just for that first batch. That doesn't give you enough runway.
First problem,
yeah, it's not gonna give you enough to like go and hire a programmer in Ukraine. And I give that specific example because I did that with my own money, and that was stupid because I was not a good.
So you built the product before validating the solution or the problem.
Oh God, I've done every single problem here. I felt like there was this great app idea for like well-being and tracking your mood and sleep and all this stuff. This is like circa 2012. And I'm like, I was just like reading every single book I could find on well-being and happiness. I was like, this is the app. And then when I found this person in Ukraine who he was doing the best that he could.
Yeah.
Shitty. I was a shitty. Anyway.
So I think just to quickly summarize all that, like in your bedroom at your parents' house, spend the next 6 months doing the research, right? And spend up to 10K to do that. If you find and validate that problem, then go try to raise or find 100K from people to build the team.
No. Yeah, go find the team first, then go raise money.
Yeah. And then from there, with the team, you can build the product, or at least initial product for the, up to 500K. That's kind of like what your angel investor size.
Yeah. The angel investors are an interesting bunch. You essentially want to find people with a chunk of money who are interested in the problem that you are solving. They're in it for the return, but also they might be in it just because they're interested in the problem, and build those relationships early on, right? Yep. You can't like ever email somebody and be like, hey, give me 100 grand, and they say yes. You want to say, hey, I'm building this thing. I saw that you're in it. Can I have a chat? Okay, great. You had a chat. Can I have a copy? I want to keep you updated on what I'm doing. Can I talk to you in 2 months? Can I talk to you? Like, there's a whole like, build your reputation and make it that you are the person in this space.
Gotcha. Well, Kayvon, it's been great chatting this week. We'll talk next week at 7 p.m. Same place.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter.